Everyone, this is Chris Grosso with the Indie Spiritualist podcast on the Be Here Now network. And my guest today is Paul Levy. Paul, thank you so much for being with me.
Yeah, I'm just so excited to be here with you. Really, thanks for the invite.
I appreciate it. So before we get into this conversation, I'm going to read a quick bio, and then we're going to jump right into it. So Paul Levy is a pioneer in the field of spiritual emergence and a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner for more than 35 years. He is the founder of the Awakening in the Dream community in Portland, Oregon, and the author of several books, including Wetiko, Undreaming Wetiko, and The Quantum Revelation. Paul lives in Portland, Oregon. So Paul, like I was saying before we hit record, Wetiko is a newer concept to me and one that I found immediately drawn to based on your work, and I find you make it very accessible. It's appreciated. We're just going to dive right in. I've read that you described Wetiko as a mind virus that feeds on our unconsciousness. So something that came to mind is, if Wetiko is the very thing that distorts our perception, how can someone begin recognizing its grip on them? Are there symptoms of Wetiko that we could be looking out for in ourselves?
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a great question. The idea of when we're acting out, whether in subtle or overt ways of self-destructive behavior, whether it's our addictions, our habitual patterns, and I see for me, and I think this is true for so many people, like, when we get close to that pain, that deep pain from whatever the unhealed trauma is, because, we're a species in trauma. And then typically we dissociate, we split, we go numb, we distract ourselves. All of that, that's not necessarily, that's Wetiko, but the idea being that you track its footprints, in your behavior and in your mind. And, the thing about Wetiko, it's so interesting because in the apocryphal text, they call it the counterfeiting spirit. And that see, the thing about Wetiko, it has no creativity, but it puts us on, it fools us, or it puts us on like a suit of clothes, in that it offers us a false identity, a fictitious version. Oh, I'm wounded, I'm limited in a certain way, I'm traumatized. And if we're not awake in that moment and we then identify with Wetiko's version of ourselves, then it has us, and then it can manipulate and control us beneath our awareness, and then we become like a puppet on a string where we just act out our compulsions, all the while imagining we're acting out our own impulses, but in actuality, something other than ourselves is in the driver's seat of our vehicle that's steering us, that's driving us. And the thing about Wetiko, it works through our unconscious, through our blind spots, because it's a form of blindness, but it's a really peculiar form of blindness because, first off, it does not know it's blind, and it actually thinks it's sighted. And not only that, it thinks it's more sighted than people who actually see. And so it's this really peculiar form of blindness. And even in the Bible, they're pointing at Wetiko. Christ is saying, yeah, people have eyes but don't see. They don't even know their eyes can see, or they're closing their eyes to the light. Because Wetiko is a self-induced, in a way, a hysterical form of psychological blindness in such a way that we hypnotize ourselves. We literally entrance ourselves via the projective tendencies of our own mind, or another way of saying that, we entrance ourselves via our own creative genius. And because Wetiko has no creativity, but it plugs into our creativity and it turns our own creativity against us in such a way that we then, like I'm saying, become an instrument for acting it out in the world. Because it's contagious. When somebody, we all potentially have Wetiko. You see, the thing I just want to get across to people, this is like, I'm just a translator, so it's nothing that I discovered. Wetiko, it's a Native American term, but every spiritual tradition talks about it just in different language. And this is the diagnosis. We've actually made a huge breakthrough. This should be headlined on media all over the world, that there's been a diagnosis of, what's at the bottom of our collective malady. Like, we are in the middle of a collective psychosis of titanic proportions. That's what Wetiko is. It's a collective psychosis. And the thing about Wetiko, though, is that, so first off, when I say it's a collective psychosis and I describe it as a mind virus, and people hear that and they're, oh, that sounds all like woo-woo and new agey and all that. But all that it means is that the origin and the solution of the collective madness that we are acting out as a species in the world is to be found within the psyche. And that's a no-brainer. Where else in the world could it be found? And, so this is like, it's a huge discovery. And Wetiko itself is a revelation. It's a living revelation. But here's the thing. So Wetiko is a quantum phenomena, which means it contains holographically encoded within it both of the opposites, in that it's the source of the deepest evil imaginable. And it has this incredible blessing and gift. It's helping us to wake up to who we are. But how it manifests, is it going to take us down? Is it going to wake us up? That depends if we recognize what it's revealing to us.
That's interesting. Like, jumping towards the end of our conversation, I had a question, suited for that, but we're stumbling on it now is, we have this mind virus, right, as you're describing it, but the beauty, maybe for lack of a better word, could be a teacher in a way, like showing us. I try to, and not in a Pollyannish, sort of way, but I try to find silver linings or look at things, and is there good from this? And so,
no, absolutely. I mean, you see, the thing is that this mind virus, it's this dreaming phenomena. And what I mean is that, it's really practically impossible to see this mind virus without realizing the dreamlike nature, that we're literally having a collective dream, that we are all dreaming up into manifestation. And the thing about this mind virus, it is, when you have the recognition that it's a revelation, that it's a dreamed up phenomena, that it's revealing something to us. And what it's revealing to us, in essence, is the primary and profound importance of the psyche in creating our experience and in creating world events. And so Wetiko, it's actually helping us to shed light on, what Jung calls the greatest danger facing humanity is to be found within the human psyche. And we are so asleep to the incredible primacy and profundity of the human psyche. And here Wetiko, being a dreamed up phenomena, like a symbol in a dream, is reflecting back to us, hey, if you marginalize the human psyche, you're basically going to be destroying yourself. So it's actually helping us to access our divine inheritance, our divine power, that to the extent that we're asleep to, and we're unaware of our, sort of this incredible divine creativity, then Wetiko, which has no creativity on its own, will plug into our unconscious creativity and turn it against us,
Yeah. So another thing I was going to ask, and you kind of already started on that, was, I wanted to see, in your perspective, what happens, when somebody fully awakens or sees Wetiko, when they actually come into that, and what does that revelation look like? Is it similar to that experience where someone, is meditating, or nature mysticism, just a complete presence? Some call it enlightenment, some call it awakening. What in your experience would you say?
Well, the thing is, I mean, it's an ongoing process. It's like if somebody, says, oh, I've seen Wetiko, or I'm awake, and like, period, end of story, I would run the other way, because to me, that person's dangerous. And if they're really identified with thinking they're awake, because, it's not that hard in a dream, in a night dream, to have a lucid dream. The challenge is that it's easy to forget and to get absorbed back into the forms of the dream. And so, that's my understanding of spiritual practice, is you really stabilize that realization of lucidity, and you become more and more familiar with that. And then what you begin to discover is that, oh my God, this thing that the Native Americans were pointing out, or like every, spiritual tradition, even visionary artists, I think there's Philip K. Dick, who actually, was completely switched on to Wetiko. He called it the Black Iron Prison. And he actually says, he goes, this mimicking stuff, because if you remember, Wetiko is a mastermind. It's the counterfeiting spirit. It impersonates us. Philip K. Dick says this mimicking stuff is the key to everything. Okay, that's how important it is. And it's like in the Castaneda books, Don Juan, Carlos's teacher, he doesn't use the name Wetiko. He calls it the predator in this particular book. And he says, this is the topic of topics. There's nothing more important than this. And I fully agree. Like, if we don't come to terms with what Wetiko is showing us, there is not going to be a human species, because then we're just going to be compelled to destroy ourselves. So the idea being, when you get switched onto it, and you get switched on to, like, say, for example, if so many of us have had, whatever problems in our family, there's an abusive family member, or, whatever. And how I first got introduced to Wetiko is that, the story isn't important. Somebody in my family was taken over by Wetiko. I didn't have any words for it. That was one thing. But then I began to recognize the whole field is configuring to protect the abuser. Whenever I was trying to shed light on what was happening, and I couldn't believe, the more light I tried to shine on the darkness, the field, the family system, conspired to actually protect the darkness. So that's when you begin to see Wetiko, that it's actually not just a quantum phenomena, but it's a field phenomena, that it informs and gives shape to the field, both within our minds, in relationships, collectively, in world events. It's actually giving shape to the whole body politic. And, that's when you begin to have the realization that, oh my God, this is a revelation. And when you see it, you really have, one of the inoculations is humility, is to realize, oh, any of us can fall prey to this. I mean, who hasn't acted out their unconscious at a given moment? And then afterwards, they're like, oh my God, what was I thinking? Well, yeah, that's normal. Everybody falls prey to that. But the idea being, if somebody feels like, oh, I'm immune, I don't have Wetiko, that person has it, but not me, that point of view is an expression that you've fallen under its spell. So it's a really trippy thing to come to terms with.
So would you say, is everyone or does everyone to a certain extent have that within them? Or are there individuals, like, when you awaken, like, you've dispelled that from yourself? Is it something you can move past?
I can imagine that, when you become fully and utterly enlightened, whatever that even means, then you're transcendent to and free of Wetiko. But, I think it's a helpful way of understanding that Wetiko exists in the collective unconscious of our species, and that's to say that we all potentially have it at any given moment. And I mean, I see in myself, here I've written 3 books about it, and I'm really switched onto it. And, and I'm just amazed what a genius I am in fooling myself, in pulling the wool over my own eyes, and tricking myself out of my right mind still, even with all my realization and awareness of Wetiko. So, that's what I mean, that it's an ongoing process.
Right. Got it. Makes sense. Something you've kind of touched on a little bit earlier, but the state of the world as we're in right now, you've spoken about or suggested that our collective, cultural systems, capitalism, media, politics, they're not just infected by Wetiko, but might actually be its perfect host. So I was wondering, do you think a system built by Wetiko can actually be used to dismantle it, or does real change require something outside of that system entirely?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. My sense is, the whoever said it, the idea of that, if there's, a system that isn't working, instead of sort of being in resistance or fighting the system, just to create, your vision of what actually of the world you want to live in, and it's interesting because the nature of our system, politically, financially, socially, culturally, on so many levels, it'll just subsume any positive creative input into its darkness, so to speak. And like people have said to me, oh, if we just figure out who the bad guys are, and just put them in jail, and I say, oh, well, that would do nothing, because it's if you don't deal with the deeper archetype, that's the higher dimensional energy that's informing and giving shape to the evil in the world. If you take out the particular people who are the instruments, without dealing with the deeper form less archetype, the archetype will just, the central casting will just send new people to play those roles. And the thing which is interesting when I mentioned about the archetype, the primordial underlying pattern that interfaces with our minds. You see, one of the things I'm trying to point out, is that the way to see Wetiko, because it's a form of blindness and it operates through our blind spots, when we don't see it, we're empowering it by turning a blind eye. So what that means is when you see how Wetiko works non-locally through the outside world, it configures events in the outer world, but it's an inner disease of our soul, and it's actually configuring our reactions and our assumptions and the lenses through which we interpret reality. So just trip out on that. It's an inner disease of the soul that has a magical ability to configure events in the outer world so as to reveal and reflect itself, right? But if you don't see that, then you're just going to unwittingly be its minion and its outpost and an instrument for Wetiko. And so that's why the incredible importance of seeing it, because then when you actually see it, it gets unemployed. You take away its power because it intrinsically is feeble. In Islam, they talk about Wetiko in the Holy Quran, in the last surah. I mean, all throughout the Quran, but in the last surah, they warn about what? About Wetiko. And they call it the slinking prompter, is one of the translations. And prompter, in that it prompts you to react, it prompts you to act out unconsciously. It prompts you to act out in an evil way. That's the prompter part. But the slinking, because it's slinking prompter, is that if you see it, if you become aware of it in the moment, it slinks away because it has no power. It's feeble. But if you don't see it, it will manifest in this really fearsome, terrifying way, and you'll just go belly up. And what you've done, you've given away your own power to it. So you see, one of the key ways of really sort of dealing with Wetiko is seeing how are we complicit? You see, because Wetiko, it can't steal our soul, but it tricks us into giving it away. That's our complicity. That's what we need to become aware of. So to just go back to this counterfeiting spirit thing, because this is a really essential way of describing Wetiko. What it does, it offers us a false version of ourselves. So we then identify with who we're not. Then we forget who we actually are. Then we disconnect from our creative power of creating our experience. That's a recipe for madness. And that's what Wetiko does. Now, if people hear about this mind virus and get all afraid, no, that's not the right way to hold this, because fear is the superfood for Wetiko. Because one way of describing Wetiko, it's an identification with who we're not. If I think I'm a separate self, well, then I've forgotten that we're interdependent and interconnected. So if I'm a separate self in here, you're an other out there. If you're an other, then I feel fear. fear is the superfood for Wetiko. So the idea, if people hear this and they think, oh, now I have something else to be afraid of, this mind virus. No, no, no. Then you're empowering it. It doesn't warrant that. Wetiko doesn't, it has no independent intrinsic existence whatsoever,
Yeah.
separate from our own mind, and yet it could destroy us. You see, that's the paradox. And but it's actually helping us to remember who we actually are.
Yeah.
That's what it's, in a way, it's forcing us to do that. But if we don't do that, then we're just going to be fated to continue our self-destruction.
Gotcha. The way you're saying actually reminds me of Ram Dass would talk about, when we were born, we kind of take on this spacesuit, and it's like right out of the gate, as children, we're being told, good boy, good girl, and this and that.
Right. And your name is this. And right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we just
Totally.
pile thing after thing on top of our true essence, that
right.
self. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so the way to deal with Wetiko is becoming more and more familiar with that true essence.
Yeah.
And then it's very much like that essence. One way of describing it in the Buddha Dharma is it's like a mirror. It's like a clear mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And you could put the vilest object in front of that mirror. The mirror will just effortlessly reflect that object, but it isn't tainted or stained by the reflection. The mirror, which underlies any and all reflections, always stays the same. It's always available. It's not, it's not made impure by however dark the reflection is. And the thing which is interesting, the mirror, like in alchemy, they talk about the philosopher's stone, which is the awakened mind, and they call it, they say it's invisible. And exactly like a mirror is invisible if there's no object in front of it that it reflects. Now, on the one hand, the reflection seems to obscure the silver surface of the mirror, but it's actually revealing it. We wouldn't notice the mirror without the reflections. So the idea being that when we feel like our stuff come up, our resistance or, impurities, whatever, which seemingly obscures our nature, that actually, depending on how we interpret it, could be the revelation of our nature. It could be reminding us of our nature in the same way that the reflection, though seemingly obscuring the face of the mirror, is actually the revelation of the mirror.
Love that. Ram Dass wrote a book, Polishing the Mirror, and talks about, we're polishing the mirror for one another. In a way, I can see that with Wetiko and
totally.
cleaning up. Yeah, that's awesome. So another parallel that I know you've drawn is you talk about, what is it, with narcissism, and that's something that I know quite a few people who've been affected by various forms of that in relationships, things of that nature. It's difficult for people. What I remember had read, you were talking about, or what I want to ask, I apologize, the difference between someone simply being a narcissist or someone being possessed by Wetiko.
Yeah.
Where's that line?
I mean, the thing about, because I've written a lot about narcissism, particularly the malignant narcissism, because my father was embodying that archetype, and it's horrible because the idea of a malignant narcissist, anybody who threatens their narcissism, the person will act out in a sadistic, malevolent way to protect their own self-image. And that's just one aspect of the multifaceted jewel of Wetiko, and because Wetiko, it's this, Jung calls it this daimonic energy, and the daimon is actually the inner voice of the guiding spirit. But when we don't relate to it consciously, and it introduces us to our calling, to our vocation, to our mission, if we turn away from that daimon, it becomes negative and becomes a demon. And and that's really a way of describing Wetiko. And a daimonic energy is a higher dimensional energy. It's an archetypal transpersonal energy that can take over and possess a person or a group of people or a species. Okay. So when somebody is turning a blind eye to their own shadow, or when Wetiko, their own reactions, or they're not doing their inner work, well, then guess what happens? Then you could say Wetiko, beneath their awareness, will literally possess them and take them over, and they're oblivious to what's happened. they typically have never felt more themselves when actually something that's alien to them. In the Castaneda books, Don Juan calls this a foreign installation, that gets set up in our psyche. It's like a shadow government that dictates to the ego, that takes over the regulatory agencies of the psyche, the psychic immune system, will just, get set up in a person's psyche. It takes over the executive function of the psyche. And then what I'm describing, this is what's happening with fascism in the world.
Yeah.
That's why in his work, Jung was super switched on to Wetiko didn't have the name. He called it totalitarian psychosis. Because if you remember, Wetiko is an inner disease of the soul that reveals itself through events in the outer world. So that totalitarian psychosis that's playing out all over the world, where fascist forces are creeping, all over the planet, that's an outer reflection of how Wetiko works inside of our mind. But the idea of malignant narcissism, that's only one aspect, because, what I'm talking about, some people can get completely taken over. And, it's a moment by moment thing. You certainly don't want to concretize anyone. But I think of my father. I mean, he just, whenever I tried to reflect his condition, he just doubled down and was embodying that. He was, like, in a way, the incarnation of Wetiko in human form. And in a way, that was a blessing for me. It almost killed me. It destroyed my entire family. I haven't had a family for over 20 years. But I was actually, I don't know whether to say strong enough or courageous or had enough awareness or love, something, it didn't destroy me. And I was able to realize, oh, this is a revelation. What I'm seeing my father play out, and how the whole field and the whole mental health system all protected him. Wow. What an amazing gift. And I never could have authored. So I was basically having a direct encounter with archetypal evil, not just personal evil, not just, personal shadow thing, but evil, the likes of which, myths and fairy tales really try to characterize. Sure. And, it was out of that confrontation, and I've been deeply, like, scarred from it, but somehow I've been able to keep my heart open and cultivate awareness. And it's empowered me to author, I've written 3 books on, on evil and the nature of Wetiko and how it's actually helping us to wake up. And I could only write those books because of my experience.
Right. And which leads me to, I know you've written about, going through this process of becoming aware of Wetiko as a shamanic initiation, and it often involves deep suffering, something I'm intimately familiar with, through my own experiences with addiction and mental health.
Right.
But, I'm wondering, does waking up to Wetiko always require suffering, or is there another path?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, when we say the word suffering, I want to sort of distinguish. On the one hand, so here, the Buddha was really a great physician, and he discovered a cure for a disease, and the disease was suffering. But that's the sort of the self-created suffering. He found the origin of that is our clinging and this grasping. And it's like we're pinching ourselves really hard, and we're, like, screaming in pain, without realizing that we ourselves are the cause of the pain. That's this like sort of unproductive suffering. That's neurotic suffering that we are doing to ourselves. And that's totally related to Wetiko. But then there's the suffering, I think of, like, a lot of the Christian mystics talk about suffering coming from God, and it purifies them, and they wouldn't have missed it for the world, and that's the sort of suffering that's very different, and the idea being to really, when that sort of suffering comes, to really embrace that, to really experience that without fighting against it, because that contraction against that suffering, like, I think of, there's a great priest, a German priest, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was like this bodhisattva in Nazi Germany, and he escaped Germany, and then felt such a mission to help his fellow, brothers and sisters, that he came back into Nazi Germany and was executed by the Nazis. But one thing he said, and interestingly, he has incredible quotes where he's saying the essence of what was happening was like this mind control. And he goes, where, people are just, it's like their minds are taken over by like an algorithm and they're just spouting slogans. And he goes, the essence of it is stupidity. There was, and it's interesting because it maps on to the current day and age. But he actually says, he goes, when we willingly embrace our pain, that spells death to evil. Okay. Yeah. And that's a quote. And the idea being that when we have pain, sometimes life is pain and or pleasure. When we have the suffering of pain, if we resist it, that becomes an infinite regress that just self-reinforces it. And then we're in samsara, then we're really in a hell realm. But the idea is that sometimes, we're feeling pain. And if we can just sort of relax into it, so to speak, lean into it and embrace it, then all of a sudden we've stepped out of that clinging, of that infinite regress, and that pain actually can be healing for us,
Yeah.
And so there are a couple of the things I just keep on remembering. I really want to make sure to share.
Please.
One is the greatest protection against Wetiko is to be in touch with who we are, with our nature. But that can be such a cliche. Like, what does that even mean? And I point out in my work that, what is the nature of our nature? By its very nature, our nature is creative. And so when you have realization of your nature, you embody being creative and you express yourself creatively. And the more you do that, the deepen is your realization of your nature in a positive feedback loop that literally creates light upon light in a world of darkness. So that's why I point out, there are a lot of ways of talking about the medicine for Wetiko is like, cultivating compassion, which really organically arises out of the recognition that we're having a dream. The other is you could say, to realize that we're having a collective dream, the dreamlike nature, to have lucidity in the waking dream. One other way of saying it in quantum physics, I wrote a book about that, and I'm pointing out that the revelations emerging from quantum physics are offering us the medicine for Wetiko, or another way of describing the medicine for Wetiko is to be creative, because if we're not creative, Wetiko, the powers that be, the powers of the state are more than happy to create our experience for us. But when we step into our own creative power, we become the author of our own waking dream. We connect with our own intrinsic authority, and then Wetiko has no currency over us, Now, one way to understand Wetiko, because it's such a profound idea, is that, just to invoke the imagination for a second and imagine you're in a night dream. And in that night dream, you're holding a viewpoint, right? And say the viewpoint is that, the world I'm in is objective and real and solid and separate from me. Okay, so what is a dream? A dream is just a reflection of your own mind, right? If I'm holding that viewpoint that this world I'm in is objective, then it will instantaneously manifest in a way that will present as being objective. So now I have all the evidence I need to confirm that my point of view is true. So I get even more fixed in my point of view that the world I'm in, this dream world, is objective. And the more I see it that way, the more it manifests that way, confirming, giving me all the evidence and proof I need that I'm seeing correctly. Ad infinitum, it's a feedback loop that self-generates, whose origin is within our own mind. And that's, in essence, what I'm describing. That's to put ourselves under a spell. That's what Wetiko is. But then here's quantum physics, which in essence, the essence of my book on quantum physics is that, it's a revelation. Quantum physics is, in Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about hidden treasures. And I talk about in the word in Tibet is terma, hidden treasures. And I point out that quantum physics is a modern day analog to a hidden treasure. It's like an alarm clock that's like programmed to go off, to wake us up, and it's a real thing. Scholars, this isn't some sort of fairy tale, this idea of that there are treasures hidden, implanted within the multidimensional fabric of the waking dream. And so quantum physics was discovered about a century ago, and it's the medicine. It's helping us to dispel Wetiko, because it is literally showing us, it's proven, oh yeah, this world isn't objective, that the observer is the observed, that the act of observation actually influences the universe that we're observing, which is to say the act of observation is creative, which is to point out that we have this incredible creative power and agency that, we're asleep to. And if we're asleep to it, then Wetiko will plug into our own creative genius and, like I'm saying, turn it against us. Right. So, that's basically why I wrote the book about quantum physics, is to try to show, oh, look, the universe itself, because quantum physics is itself a dreaming phenomena. It's a revelation the likes of which we've never encountered. And it's literally staring us in the face. We just have to really open our eyes and see what it's revealing to us. It's showing us, it's unlocking the incredible intrinsic genius that's inherent to our nature, that is who we are, and that's really the solution for this incredible world crisis we're in right now.
Well, yeah, and I was going to ask, and very well said. Thank you for all of that. You've been working with Wetiko for decades now. Do you find there are ways that it shows up that still surprise you at this point?
Yeah, well, the way I would say that is I'm continually just deepening my realization of Wetiko, because I spend a lot of time every day going down the rabbit hole trying to follow what's going on and really understand what is happening, and and all that. And and then so many people, because I interface with a lot of people throughout the week. Yeah. So many people are freaking out or upset or, aligned in this way or aligned in that way. People are so polarized. Yeah. And I'm ever increasing my understanding of Wetiko, and one way of understanding that, and the quantum physicists talk about this. They say, yeah, it's only been in the world now for 100 years. And it's such a radical discovery that we're at the beginning stages of understanding what it's showing us. It's like we're at the seashore and there's a vast ocean of understanding. And that's how I feel about Wetiko, that I'm just as one person. Yeah, my eyes have been opened and I see it and I track it and I write about it and I dream about it and all that. And I'm in the ring with it every day, And, but I'm just ever expanding my realization,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And so if there's one thing, and you may have already covered this, but, as we're starting to get close to the end here, is if there's one thing you can make absolutely clear to the world about Wetiko, what would that be?
Yeah. Well, what comes up is that, so on the one hand, I'll answer this in a roundabout way. Yeah. I get triggered by spiritual people. I'm a spiritual person, but I get triggered by spiritual people who are just in the world right now, who are just oh, I'm just going to meditate and pray and do my mantras and everything will be fine. And yeah, there might be some people who are really called to being hermits like that and yogis like that. But so often that's just an expression of their narcissism, because they're not recognizing that their inner process is manifesting in, as, and through the outer world, which is to say the way to work on our inner process is to fully engage in life and be actively involved in the body politic, whatever that even looks like. I'm writing books, but people could be protesting or writing to their congressman or whatever. Yeah. So on the one hand, not just to sort of go fully inwards at the expense of being in the world, because that itself could be an expression that fallen under the spell of Wetiko. But the idea being too, you don't want to be actively involved in political activism without spiritual understanding. I talk about it being a cross pollination, with the political activism and the spiritual understanding cross pollinate each other. But to get back to your question, because all of that was preparation,
Yeah.
is the idea of that Wetiko. It's literally revealing to us the profound importance of the psyche in creating our experience and in creating world events. And so the idea being, I think of Jung, he talks about the psyche is the secret place. It's the place where the magical elixir that heals our species is to be found. And, so I'm not saying, oh, just drop everything and go inwards. I'm saying, no, we need to be actively engaged and involved in the outer world and being politically active, absolutely, in whatever way we can, but don't marginalize and don't forget doing our inner work. So, for example, the way Wetiko works, it's an inner disease of the soul that actually, like I'm saying, it actually extends itself out in the world and configures events in our lives, both, just in our personal sphere, in our relationships, but in the world stage. Now, like the unconscious, when we see the unconscious, it's impossible to not have your unconscious activated when you see it. The unconscious is non-local. The point is, you see somebody embodying the unconscious, your unconscious gets activated, gets triggered. Then you have to metabolize what's gotten triggered in you. And then when you integrate that, then you're able to to intervene. Same thing with Wetiko. So say something's happening in the world, whether it's with this candidate or that president or this whoever, and we're triggered. Oh, that's evil. Okay, don't stop there. What about how are you reacting? What's getting touched in you? And then by turning your awareness on, it's an incredible opportunity to shed light on whatever unconscious content has gotten constellated in you. Then you put the light of your own awareness on that, and guess what? You then can potentially assimilate an unconscious part of your shadow. And then when you do that, you see, it makes me think of the way to deal with the darkness in the world. If people are just triggered and fighting against it, well, then it's like darkness trying to get rid of darkness. But if we actually are able to shed light on our own darkness and really illumine that and be aware of that to whatever degree we can, then we can actually, be of help in a world of darkness.
Yeah, well said. I'm thinking about, as you're talking about that, there have been times in my life where I've very seriously considered joining a monastery. I even printed out once for Pema Chodron's Gampo Abbey, the packet to fill out, and I had to check myself. It's like, do I really want to go in as a monastic, or is this just another form of means of aversion for me at this time? And when I took an honest look, it was, and that's not to say, of course, people that do that, like you said earlier, if you're really called to that, beautiful. We need those people.
Yeah. Right.
But for me, it wasn't. It was a different way of dropping out. So I appreciate what you said.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So just two last things I wanted to touch base with you on. One is, we live in this age of AI, right? It's a big thing. I couldn't help but think as I was, sifting through your books, but we have Wetiko. It's kind of ingrained, as you've said, within this experience of human to a certain extent. And here we are as human beings creating this magnificent artificial intelligence that a lot of people believe it's going to solve all our problems. And AI is going to create even more conscious and intelligent forms of itself. I'm wondering if we are the ones that are creating this and Wetiko is not within us and AI is, taking information from us. Do you feel like there's a way it could, and this is conjecture, I understand that, but do you feel like there's a way that this could essentially find its way into artificial intelligence and from the human experience since we created it.
You mean that to have Wetiko find its way
Yeah,
in? Oh,
within the
absolutely.
AI.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
It reminds me of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice,
yeah,
who, one of the images, they can conjure up a tiger and then the
yeah,
tiger devours them. And
yeah,
in a way, we are potentially in that role of that Sorcerer's Apprentice of conjuring something up that then could potentially destroy us. And AI, I see it as a quantum phenomenon. And what I mean, same thing with quantum physics. It can be used for the highest good or the darkest evil, depending on whose hands it gets in.
right.
And AI could have incredible benefits for the human species, or it could be our worst nightmare, you know? And yeah, it's the X factor from my point of view, because in a sense, what we're experiencing now is an iteration of, a self-generating fractal of like war and income inequality and poverty and shadow projection and all that stuff. We've been through that in different iterations all throughout history, but we've never had anything like AI. And, so yeah, that's a real X factor. And, you know, whatever, I just pray that it gets used in a way that's going to be beneficial, because, the other way is just, it's chilling. It's very, very frightening.
Yeah, yeah, it sure is. All right, so Paul, let's say a listener, is here at the end as we're wrapping up this conversation and identifies with a lot of what you've spoken about. And it's, wow, okay, I'm becoming aware of, Wetiko within myself. What would you recommend once they're done listening to this conversation? What can they do? I know you mentioned mindfulness, awareness. What are some I want to leave our listeners with some medicines, that they
Yeah,
can
yeah,
walk
yeah.
away with.
Well, one thing that comes up that I haven't mentioned, because I could go on for hours. I mean, this is
Yeah.
such a profound topic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I'm saying, it's what every spiritual tradition, you know, from the history of this planet has been basically pointing at Wetiko, and why are they pointing at it? Because nobody sees it, and it's the most important thing. It's the topic of topics,
Mm.
and the psychological, sort of dynamic of Wetiko is projecting the shadow, is scapegoating, shadow projection. And so I can share with people how this works, because it's, I think we've all experienced this on both sides, being the recipient of, oh, somebody's projecting a shadow on me, or I'm unconsciously projecting the shadow on someone else. So think about it. Think about if I am disowning my own shadow, my own darkness, right? So then what do? I disconnect from it. I project it out of myself. Now, and just remember, I'm describing this universe as being a dream, right? So in a dream, if I project out, say, a shadowy part of myself, what's going to happen? In the dream will walk in will come a person or a group of people who are carrying my shadow. Because, I mean, I've dreamed them up. I've dreamed somebody, here's part of my own wholeness of my psyche, the darker part that I'm disowning, projecting it out. It gets dreamed up into materialized form. Here, some people are carrying my shadow. And so there, and what is a dream but a reflection? So I see them embodying my shadow and I contract against it, right? And when I amplify that process, well, first off, once they're embodying that shadow and carrying my own darkness, I now have all the evidence confirming, oh, the evil is out there, because look, they're acting it out. And of course, I'm just all pure and white and light, and the darkness, the evil is out there. So that just like even more entrenches me in my viewpoint of projecting the darkness out there, because I have all the confirmation, I have all the evidence and the proof. Just look at what they're doing. And when you amplify, because a good way of doing dream work is amplifying a process, what eventually guaranteed will happen is I will try to destroy them. And how come? Well, I am actually acting out my inner process, the initial inner process of wanting to exterminate my own darkness. Now I'm playing it out in the outer world. Remember, Wetiko is an inner disease that plays itself out in the outer world, like a reflection of the inner. And so then, of course, they're trying to do the same to me. And guess what? The more I try to exterminate the evil out there, the more I get possessed by the very evil I'm trying to exterminate, you know? And what I just described, now, interestingly, just getting back to shadow projection,
Yeah.
Jung in his work, he described shadow projection as the lie. Well, who is the liar? It's the devil. The idea being that when we don't own our own darkness and when we unconsciously project it out, because like Jung says, anything unconscious always approaches us from outside of ourselves. It gets dreamed up and it appears as something other. The key thing is to recognize that it's our own reflection. And that shadow projection is a process that all of us interact with and interface with from both sides, you know, throughout our lives. And understanding that really can help people to really get more of a handle on Wetiko and what I'm trying to point at.
Love that. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. So before we wrap up, I would love to give the floor to you. You know, there's so much, your breadth of work, far beyond, you know, the scope of which we cannot cover in 1 hour. Is there anything that I didn't bring up, that we didn't address, that you would like to talk about, leave our listeners with, before we bring this to a close?
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate that. Well, you know, it's like in a dream. When you have a dream and then you have the recognition of the nature of your circumstance, you know, that you're dreaming, you know, that's when you all of a sudden have a lucid dream. And for me, years ago, when I first began having lucid dreams, every single time I would become lucid, spontaneously, I would start chanting Om Mani Padme Hung, Om Mani Padme Hung, the mantra of compassion. And then I learned in Buddhism that awakening is always the combination of two factors of what's called emptiness and compassion. And emptiness is lucidity. Emptiness is the realization that there is no intrinsic, independent, objective reality separate from your own awareness. That's to become lucid in a dream. But if it's full awakening, if it's a real awakening, it's always emptiness, i.e., lucidity, and compassion. So if people really want to, you know, awaken in the dream, you know, I really counsel them, well, to the extent you're able to cultivate real, genuine compassion, that would really serve you, because compassion is the Wetiko dissolver par excellence, okay? And it's a nuclear power. Don't underestimate the power of real compassion. Yeah. And even one person, even one of us, you know, really connecting with our compassion. In Buddhism, it's called the precious bodhicitta. His Holiness Dalai Lama calls it the good heart. It's the heart of awakening, the heart filled with love, with compassion. Any one of us doing that, any one of us seeing the dreamlike nature, any one of us owning our shadows, seeing Wetiko, tapping into the quantum, could be the very thing that changes everything. Like the image in his work, Jung uses the image when you take grains of sugar and you dissolve them in water, in a glass of water, they just dissolve and dissolve. But then it reaches the saturation point. You add one more grain of sugar and a crystal manifests. And he says that's the way symbols crystallize in the unconscious. But any one of us having the realization of our nature, embodying compassion, could be that grain of sugar that creates a global awakening in our entire species. Yeah. And, you know, and I could say a lot more about that, but that's a very hopeful vision. And it really can inspire us, because we're part of the mind control, part of the brainwashing is that we're helpless, things are hopeless. But like quantum physics is saying, no, each one of us has this unimaginably vast creative power that we're unaware of. And maybe even one of us waking up to that might be that grain of sugar that changes everything.
I can think of a better note to end this conversation on, and one we need so desperately right now in this world: hope.
Yeah.
It is. It's someone told me in Italy, an old man once. He said, "Hope, it's the last to die," and I hold that dearly in my heart. So, Paul, I can't thank you enough for your time, for the work you're doing in the world, your contributions. Where can people find you online?
Okay, if the way I will say it is that if you're interested, if you want to awaken in the dream, go to awakeninthedream.com. That's my website.
Great.
And, it's not monetized. Yeah, people can buy a book, autograph book, or book a session, but everything else, there's no paywall because this is medicine. I want to get this out. So
Yeah.
there's a ton of interviews like this. There's a ton of articles, because I just want to get this out for people. So that's where they would go.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. That's why I wanted to have you on the show. It's not only am I fascinated by your work, but the way you're showing up in the world, it's appreciated. So,
Yeah, thank
I hope our listeners check this out. If you're listening to this on the Be Here Now page, just scroll down. We'll have that website linked. If not, awakeninthedream.com. Paul, thank you so much for your time.
Really, just thank you. Just super appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks.